let me ask you about that, since you have insight into it, because what we're talking about is really, on one level, first order problem is distinct from politics and ideology. Mm-hmm. It is really just a systemic, it's just that you have an institution that has become sclerotic and corrupted in many respects, and because no one's really been paying attention to it in some way. Like, people are making money. No one's going to lift up the lid and look in there and see what's going on. And that is completely distinct from an ideological, I mean, there may be some things may track it. Like, if you have people who really think that money is the ascendant value, and I get into a system, that's what I'm going to pull out of it. But but in terms of the way that I think most people understand politics as, a function of issue sets and this and that, that's not what they're there for. They're there because they're enriching themselves. Yes. It's a lot like, almost like in some ways, local politics. How wide is the understanding of that? What is going to deal with it? Because, there's multiple forces where you have, like, the Obama people really wanted to maintain control, it seems to me, of not so much the machine. Like, I didn't get the sense that the Obama people wanted, because they were making the money from it, as much as, like, we don't want the party to move in a direction that we sort of think is politically wrong, but they were willing to maintain an apparatus that is inherently dysfunctional. I mean, it seems like, it's just by definition of, it's losing races across the country in races that in an environment where it shouldn't have. I mean, 2008, we should have been able to get rid of, like, there shouldn't have, people would have to look in the history books to see what a Republican Party is. I mean, theoretically, if we had been, if the party apparatus had been functioning the way it should have been. So how do you dislodge that? Because it's really basically what you're trying to do is keep people from making money the only way they know how. And people tend to, like, in my experience, hold on to that very tightly.
Yeah, especially if their identities are attached to it. And
of course.
And no one's ever looked into,
So this is a problem that people have, like, in businesses too. Like, how do we get rid of this culture in this business?
Yeah. So this was my pet issue. Maybe some of your listeners and viewers saw the video that went viral, the last commission, where I basically had a meltdown and I dropped an F-bomb on the floor. Well, the backstory on that was, first thing, it was after 8 months of debating this. We just come out of a room where we had an agreement on one of my resolutions. Then we went onto the floor, and all the other side, they started questioning it. And so right before me, Gus Newport, one of our appointees, he said something very powerful, and he said it was ridiculous. And then it was my resolution, so I just, flipped the heck out. But I think you have a couple issues here at play. Human nature. People want to keep their money, and this is what they've attached themselves to. And there's a lot of people who literally failed up in democratic politics. In fact, I'd say the majority of consultants out there are just failing up and giving really bad advice. So if you plan on running for office, most of them are full of shit.
And let me just say this, just so that people understand sort of what intersects with this conversation. I interviewed Ryan Grimm about his piece in The Intercept, which talked about DNC and DCCC representatives coming into campaigns, often choosing the wrong people, and sort of bigfooting the local people in many respects. There was another report by Theda Skocpol and Lena Putnam that showed the same dynamic. Not with the ideological differences. I mean, you're talking about people who might be, just sort of mainstream Democrats, but also feeling the same way of, like, hey, wait a second, the people are coming in and they're bigfooting us, and they're not listening to people on the ground who have a sense of what's going on in the district. And so it's you have these stories of a dysfunctional system within the party that I think is less ideological and more sort of like systematized, or there's got to be some business management term for what the problem is.
So I think it's intentional. I'm at this point in the game, and I think if I had said this 2 months ago, I'd been called a conspiracy theorist. I think at this point in the game, it's so clear that this model doesn't. The model doesn't work, but then it's so clear that some of these people and these ideas, after being called out so openly, they're being exposed and they're still doing it. There's some other thing happening. I'm going to rewind a little bit. In the late 70s, the Democratic Party purged union. They literally made a decision with the DLC. The DLC, I'm not fucking around here when I say this. I can say fuck, right?
Yeah, but not the DLC, not the Democratic Leadership Council.
The DLC, this is important. The DLC, one of the earliest investors, this is in the 80s though, was the Koch brothers, but it was all around that time.
But this is 1980.
1980, right.
Now, in the early 70s,
late 70s, I'm saying.
In the early 70s, unions were pushed to the sideline by the McGovern Commission. In fact, that's where the whole superdelegates reform came from, because they didn't want it the back room, and they didn't want just the union heads to be. And there was an attempt to move towards the suburbs, and we've done a couple of interviews on that over the past couple of years. But yes, but in the 80s,
there was this movement, right?
There was an idea of like, we need more corporate money.
Exactly. So you had the purging, the actual DNC members being purged, the union members being purged and replaced with corporate members. I think it was. I don't think they legalized lobbyists then. I think that was later. But
Tony Coelho. Yeah. Right. Okay. So go ahead. But
love that guy. So this was all happening, and at the same time, the centralization of the DNC happened. So what does that mean? It means that the DNC is no longer putting all of its money into state parties, and it was the death of the clubs. I mean, there were clubs everywhere, precinct captains. It was an investment in neighborhood democratic politics, which really was hand in hand with unions. If you think about unions, I had a friend of mine say this the other day. He's a consultant, and he was trying to find somebody for somebody's campaign. I'm not going to say who. And he is a very good consultant. Like, there's not many, but he's kind of like the guy that you call for help in the end. And he said, there's no infrastructure. There's no infrastructure. He goes, there's no talent. There's no talent being groomed. And he said it used to be that the unions worked with the Democrats on this. And when you kill unions, when you kick them out of your party, when the Koch brothers are going after them state by state, now, I mean, the Janus ruling, whatever's left of them, these were the organizers. Right. These were the precinct captains. And at the same time, the Democratic Party decides they're only going to focus on presidential politics, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry. The only time we kind of went back was in 2006 when we won the House.
And we should say these decisions were made at a time where the Democratic Party had controlled the House, the House for 40 years.
Yes.
There was never a time, and these guys, I don't know if you appreciate this, there was never a time where the Democrats did not control Congress in the entire post-war period. And so they felt like, we don't need to do anything about it. We don't need this infrastructure. We got to play this game of like 30,000 feet. We'll deal only with the president because we'll never have to worry about Congress. And of course, in the mid-90s, then that falls apart.
Is insane. So unions are being attacked.
Certainly in retrospect. I don't know. I don't know at that time if some type of redeploying of your, I can understand why someone might get cocky over 40 years, like, we got this. And
I mean, listen, but Governor Cuomo has accepted more money from the Koch brothers than Scott Walker did.
Right.
At some point, we just have to sit there and say to ourselves, is the tail wagging the dog, or is the dog? I mean, like, this is. It's not that the Koch brothers invested in state parties because the Democrats were no longer investing, which is the message I kept hearing. I'm hearing, why the hell did the Democrats stop investing in their state parties and weaken the party? It's basically disaster capitalism for the Democratic Party. And then as a result, they have these private entities where they bring the billionaires in and the Democracy Alliance, and there's no oversight. Right. And suddenly the billionaires know better about electoral politics, and the new Eric Holder Obama group to protect legislatures. Where the hell were you over the last 8 years? You essentially didn't pay attention to the DNC and the DLCC. Whose job that is? Right.
Let me tease out what you mean by this disaster capitalism. No, I mean, I think this is a really interesting point. The idea being that once you deplete the infrastructure, the sort of the disaggregated infrastructure that is, I don't want to get overly dramatic, but more democratic and dispersed, and it's hierarchical because it's a system, but it is staffed. It comes from communities up, and it populates it up that way. And once that's gone, then you come in and say like, oh, well, we need an infrastructure. The only way to get that is to buy it. And we're going to buy it with a huge amount of money. We're going to, come from outside of town, and we're going to build it from like that, which is exactly, the model of disaster capitalism. And all of a sudden now the authority shifts from the local people and the infrastructure to the big money people who've just parachuted in. And they're also, not only is it bad in terms of who has control, but it also is repeatedly less effective.
Yeah.
And we've seen that. And we've seen that dramatically. And simultaneously, on the right, we've seen the growth in particular of, and I think this is why it's, of mega churches and of religious institutions that have filled this void. And then a huge amount of money that comes in from the Koch brothers. And the way they spend money is pretty adept. Like they spread it around like, we're going to, 1,000 flowers are going to bloom.
And they're strategic. They're very strategic about where they're investing, who they're investing in, listen, Scott Walker, they
groomed him from like when he was like a county, I don't know, a dog catcher or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's they wage wars in areas that they know they can win. We don't do that as Democrats. I will say there was this brief period, obviously it was over a decade ago, but in 2006 when we won back the House, there's no coincidence that, and granted there was an anti-war movement and a lot of stuff was happening. And
anti-corruption was the big thing.
But we also invested in every state under Howard Dean's DNC.
Yes.
And there's this book, what is it called? It's Lindsay Marks. He was the former finance director of the DNC during that time. And he talks about the inner fundraising, like the rise of fundraising in the Democratic Party. And it's fascinating because at the end of the book, there's this moment where he's discussing Senator Schumer, Rahm Emanuel, and Howard Dean sitting in the room talking about this program to invest in states. And Rahm Emanuel at that time, who was a congressman at the time, was also the head of the DCCC. And he was fighting with Dean about the 50-state strategy because he goes, why invest in states when we're not competitive states? Why should we invest there? And to me, that's the essence of their argument is like, why should we spend our money everywhere when we could just spend it in a couple of places? But that's based on an assumption of the DCCC understanding what that district is going through. And what we're seeing is places like John Ossoff. What? Right. How many million? $40 million? What was that? Right. $40 million on that race for somebody who like basically wasn't even from there, had no, was a staffer. Nothing wrong with being a staffer, but like milquetoast, boring.
Well, right. I mean, John Ossoff wins. It's not really going to change the tide of anything. It's not like we're going to install like it's Tip O'Neill, and he's just been out of office for 2 years. We got to get him back in. Right. It's not like even winning doesn't seem like the return on investment. Even if he wins, doesn't seem that high.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a real it's a real problem, and I wonder. I mean, give me your sense of. I guess it is to break that logjam. I mean, is there another way to go around it? Is something like the DSA on some level seems to be. I mean, it doesn't have nearly the resources, to compete, but it has I should restate that. In places where it's strong, it clearly has resources that aren't necessarily dollar based. Right? There's services in kind. Because you have motivated people. But that's not an answer for 2018
for every election,
2020. Right. I mean, it's what is the answer? Is there an answer? And
well, we do have to reform the DNC. And while the DNC is not the DCCC or the DSCC, it helps that if we actually flip the model the way that we've been pushing, and I do think that there's an appetite for that in the DNC membership, and I want to make that, a lot of people
there's
are
like 470 members of the DNC.
Yeah.
Is that what it is?
I think so.
Well, let's just call it 450 for the sake of argument. How aware are these people? Because most of the people I meet who are members of the DNC are not they're not Darth Vader. I mean, I think there may be a couple of Darth Vaders in Washington.
There are definitely some Darth Vaders in the DNC, but there are also a lot of good people who understand their districts. They ran for DNC. They are involved. They're not as many union people anymore, but I would say this is the way I break it down when I try to explain to people where the DNC stands. It's not like this entity, this megalith, they all think the same way. That's not how it functions. It's a diverse group from all 50 states and the territories and abroad, Democrats abroad. And I would say there's 35% of the DNC have conflicts of interests. They're lobbyists. They literally make money off the DNC. They've worked at the DNC. They're in and out.
That to me is like the typical I live in a small town. I'm going to join the United Way, and the United Way needs to print some flyers. I happen to own a printing company.
That's exactly it.
I mean, it's basically that type of dynamic, right?
Except the guy who's printing the flyers wouldn't be on the board of the United Way, or it's pretty sad when Goldman Sachs has more board oversight than the Democratic Party does over its executive committee.
Right. And what's the way to reform that? Is it simply to reach those 450 people and say, you got to vote for somebody different?
No, yes. But also the recommendations that we have actually address a lot of these reforms. So this was Dr. Jim Zogby and I were on the party reform committee, and we pushed for budget transparency. And when I mean budget transparency, I don't mean a pie chart that's what they use. Right. They use a pie chart. And they're like, our budget's transparent. We spent all this money here. They don't say how much money's come in, where they're spending it, who are the consultants, are there bid contracts. So
there's just no proper oversight.
There's no oversight. It's a joke.
And if the 450 members of the DNC had the proper oversight, that they would be fixing this.
And they want it. I think that the majority of them want it. What we saw with the DNC chairs race, it was very close. Don't forget that first ballot.
Right.
Tom Perez won it by 1.5, because Democrats abroad is 1.5. 1.5 votes. And then it moved to the second ballot, and some shenanigans happened behind the scenes beyond the president calling people on the floor. There was some other stuff that happened. But that was when, the party was split then. I think that we probably have more people on our side, especially after a win like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I think a lot of people are starting to see that the current model is not working. But these are the insiders. They're still insiders.
Right.
So they're still, even though they might be moved by the people and have personal opinions about things, some of these folks are worried about making the chair upset. There's still that institutional establishment mindset. And that's what we have to overcome.